All right, hello everyone. This is our, I think, third or fourth High Council meeting, and the nominal subject of this meeting is going to be pandemics. Given recent events around the globe, I thought it would be appropriate to go over how pandemics will play a role in Songs of the Eons, as well as all of the associated variables related to pandemics like nutrition, commerce, weather patterns, and things of that nature. Before we start, I'd just like to give everyone a heads up on what's been going on with songs. And basically, the COVID pandemic ate up about, I'd say, at least on my part, maybe 3 months or so of songs work. Because the kids were home from school, my work life was in chaos due to the pandemic. And so it took a while for everything to kind of calm down a little bit. But I feel like we're back on track. Partly because thank you, No Name, for basically kicking me in the ass and getting me to do these meetings, and it really kind of put some fire under me and got me in a place where I feel like I could continue the development process. Plandeal's been working on things for a while too, and so the torch hasn't been out completely, but hopefully we'll be making some more progress from here on out and get 0.2 to the general audience sooner than later. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about disease pandemics a little bit. Disease pandemics, I have a little bit of experience when I modeled them back in Mayo and Taxes, and it was a lot of fun because diseases are a thing that you can predict in gameplay terms. Like, you can expect that they will happen at some point, and they cause kind of a disturbance and upheaval in kind of like the geopolitical state of affairs, based on kind of how you've been managing your society. And in Mayo and Taxes, when I modeled diseases, I didn't just include, for instance, the fact that the disease happened to appear in a particular place. I took into consideration things like the current nutrition and well-being of people that lived in the province, how crowded they were, how affluent they were, how much commerce happened to be in the place that was being infected, and then whether there was much connectivity between that place that was being infected and other locations as well. And so there are all these different variables that can go into pandemics to determine how bad they are, how disruptive they are, and it basically helps to make the game more exciting in a way that's logical, that isn't just like having a comet slam into your city. And it helps to kind of challenge the player and shakes things up. And so we're hoping to adhere to those same principles and apply them in Songs of the Eons as well, except now we have way more variables where we can actually plug them in to determine the nature of the pandemic and how it spreads. So I'll go ahead and open up the floor to looks like we have a little issues here. I can hop onto this stream if you need to hear me. But I'll go ahead and open up the floor to questions from some of our High Council members as it pertains to pandemics, and then we'll just kind of follow the conversation from there.
Well, I was asked to ask a question on behalf of somebody else, so I'll begin with that one. Someone asked me to ask you whether disease resistances would be modeled in such a way that something like the smallpox epidemic in Mesoamerica that devastated the Aztecs could be modeled.
Yeah, I mean, that's tricky, right? Because you have to, theoretically, since we're going to be tracking pops and information about pops and data about nutrition and things like that, you can theoretically have a variable for sort of like whether a population has been exposed to a specific strain of a type of disease and stuff like that. But you don't want to, for instance, have like such a heavy memory imprint that it becomes too clunky. So for instance, like if you were trying to track population's resistance to like 20 different strains of diseases, and you have like 20 different variables on a given pop, which decays over time based on the last time they were infected with that kind of disease. But I think it's definitely possible. We just have to come up with a practical way to have an economical way to deal with it. Because you also, like, the first time a novel disease hits a population, you want it to have that big deadly impact, right? Like bubonic plague was way more destructive on its first wave and then its second wave than it did on successive waves, right? And so I think in one form or another, we definitely need that kind of resistance variable. We would just have to do it at a level that's not too granular. So for instance, I mean, we'd have to probably run some numbers on it, but I think it might be reasonable to have a given pop have maybe innate resistance values to maybe 3, 4, or 5 different types of diseases in general. That way, if you were to have, for instance, a disease on this continent jump over to another geographically isolated continent like this, the first time it goes through, it would be massively disruptive, like we saw in North and South America when the conquistadors came over. So yeah, good question. Any follow-ups?
So the first time a disease would hit, actually kind of related to that, since we're starting from very, very early, how are you going to model the emergence of endemic and pandemic diseases? Because those are things that if you look far enough back in human history, they didn't exist, right? You don't actually get them until you have things like trade networks and cities and stuff. So how are you going to model that, and is it going to be tied into zoological concerns? Like if you have a population like the Native Americans who just don't have that many domesticated animals, is that going to basically make it so that they just don't develop endemic or pandemic diseases?
Yeah, it's kind of tricky because also you have to consider that when we generate the world, like we have to add in, so we need the emergence of new diseases that could either come from another animal or diseases which are simply radical mutations on diseases that are already kind of roaming around. And so when a world is first created and aged, we're going to need to create diseases which presumably have been around for a while, but then also have potential diseases which can be especially deadly but leap from animals or dare I say between races. That's another thing we have to figure out too, is the different races have different innate resistances to different types of diseases. But we'll have to basically, and this is feedback of course that you guys can have, but we have to decide, like, are all races potentially vulnerable to the same diseases? Are just like the humanoids, like your orc, elf, human, dwarves sort of have their own cluster of diseases, and then your harpies, since they're anatomically different and have a common ancestor that are further away, do they have their own cluster of diseases? That's something we're going to have to figure out, but it creates some interesting gameplay implications, because if everyone's susceptible to the same diseases, right? Let's say you have a whole bunch of different races on the same continent. You have a disease that sweeps across the continent. If everyone is vulnerable to that same disease, then everyone kind of gets hit just as badly, barring whether they have certain geographic isolation advantages or stuff like that. But if different races have different levels of vulnerability to different kind of diseases, you could have, for instance, a collection of dwarves that live up in the mountains that aren't affected at all, and then the humans are devastated, and so then it creates sort of an opening for the dwarves to have a bigger impact on that continent, right? And so the gameplay implications of sort of who's vulnerable to what diseases could be pretty significant. We'll have to figure out how we want to handle it. It could even be a kind of thing that you determine in the defines, right? It could be some people might want to have a world where a vermin gets infected, is just as susceptible to a human as a certain disease, but some people might want to play in the world where that's not true. So we'll have to...
I would expect to see some variation. Like it simply wouldn't make sense for if two things were biologically distinct that the disease would interact with them the same way. Like especially ones that work by like with cell genetics, like viruses and the like. And plus, from a gameplay perspective, if we did have everything be affected by diseases equally, now make the long-lived races fairly meaningless. Because, like, say you're an elf and you could theoretically live indefinitely, but like if you're more likely than not going to get cut down by a plague within the first 100 years, are you really that immortal?
Right. So there's.
I think it would make some sense for there to be some differences. Now, like there should be ways for to cross pollinate between the two of them if that's in the right order. Like in real life, how diseases can transfer between animals and humans, but like I would expect the symptoms and severity to be different depending on the creature.
Yeah, and so there's two things there. There's like two things to unpack there. You have we already have a system planned where different races have different innate capacity to resist infectious and chronic diseases. So elves, for instance, are super resistant to chronic diseases, almost immune, which is why they can live theoretically longer than any other race because they don't get cancer, they don't have like heart disease, stuff like that. And then they have a pretty good above average resistance to infectious diseases too, so that it's less likely that some kind of plague is guaranteed to kill them off before they reach the age of 200, right? And then you have other races like some of the more R-selected races, which are pretty vulnerable to diseases, but it doesn't really matter because their populations can rebound so quickly. And then you have others like the vermin who are very R-selected and have a decent resistance to diseases, but then can carry the disease without it negatively affecting them, and thus they can kind of spread it around and wreak havoc accidentally with other races as they move around, right? So there's sort of the point of how much whether a specific disease affects a specific different races differently, and then there's the point of how resistant overall a given race is to infectious diseases in general. And you see that same kind of thing exist in the real world in biology, where some species have rather exceptional ability to resist infectious diseases, and others have a pretty poor ability. But yeah, any follow-ups there? Any more questions here?
I mean, you kind of also have to have the same question for like livestock and crops to some extent, because like livestock diseases and crop diseases have historically been pretty damaging.
Oh, that's interesting. So you're making the point of you're making a point about not diseases that jump from animals to humans or intelligent races, but diseases that literally just rotate around in the livestock population and cause malnutrition to those that are raising them because your animals are dead and you can't eat now. Right.
Like in today's like in today's iron economy, like you get an outbreak of mad cow, you have to kill a couple herds. The price of beef goes up. In a prehistoric economy, or even a medieval economy, you lose a crop, a whole wave of a crop, one type of crop to a disease, or you lose a herd, your village is screwed for a generation.
I wonder, and this would be an area. This is an area I don't actually haven't really read up much about, but like I wonder to what extent how much more common those kinds of livestock diseases and plant blights occurred, how much it occurred in pre-modern times and how much it occurred in globalized times when diseases could be transferred around the globe very easily. I'm curious to what extent is human, I don't actually know the answer to that, but that could be a good point. I honestly haven't even really thought about it that much from like a performance memory management standpoint, like how you would keep track of that kind of thing. I imagine you could probably do it, but it would need to be a bit more simplistic than the kind of diseases that would roam around with intelligent species. That's an interesting point. It'd be great if someone could read up a bit more on that. If there were, if there were a lot of records of instances of things like famines induced by animal diseases.
I think one of your issues you're going to have in pre-modern times is attribution with that, because it's going to be like, I'm sure you could find like records of, we had a famine, or there were crop failures, but I'm not sure that they're necessarily going to know that it was because, the plants had a disease. I know there have been lots of problems in pre-modern times with like livestock diseases, but I don't know if they would have their records with plants, or if it would just say something like, and in such and such a year we had the famine.
Right. And there's also, you have an issue where livestock is raised very, very differently than they are now. So, in pre-modern times, like, you didn't cram your livestock onto a feedlot, like, because of the nature of grazing, it had to be relatively dispersed. And even if you were overgrazing the land, like, they would exist in herds, but they wouldn't literally be, like, crapping on each other, right?
Right.
And you wouldn't be doping them up with all kinds of antibiotics in anticipation that these diseases would be roaring through your livestock. But I imagine if you were a steppe person or some kind of pastoralist, like, that kind of thing would be something you'd have to worry about. But I've never actually read about any records in that regard. But we should, because it could be a very important thing to consider. Thanks for bringing it up, actually, Zach. It's a good subject. I have to keep that in mind. Anyone else got something?
I wondered whether the game should have diseases that are real or fictional or some mixture. So it could have smallpox and dysentery, but also some fictional disease like rot foot or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Or magical diseases, right? Like necromancy plagues and things like that. You get into, and then you have to be like, all right, well, does my magical plague operate kind of on the same principles as a regular plague? I would imagine that because it's like, all right, well, if we're gonna have like orcs that don't exist and elves that don't exist and high beavers that don't exist, like, we'll probably need some diseases, right, to accompany those fantasy races. Have some fantasy disease versions which generally behave the way that real diseases behave, but might have, for instance, some novel means of transition, right? So like a human in the real world, a human's not going to have sex with a high beaver, but that could be, a way that like some weird
in terms of performance, I kind of think that going with an ahistorical and sort of like randomly generated disease route might be more easier in terms of performance. So instead of saying, all right, we have 20 different diseases, everybody has immunities based on those 20 different diseases, you have like maybe 6 immunity disease, immunity genes A through F, and a disease uses, when you randomly generate a disease, it uses 2 of those 6 immunity genes, if that makes sense.
Oh, that's interesting, right? So basically, depending on sort of like the common descent of the virus in question, you'd come up with a lineage and be like, okay, this new disease appends here to this overarching lineage, right?
I was just going to say randomly generate them, but sure.
Because then you could sort of infer resistance, and you could actually just have a couple of variables on a specific you'd basically be keeping most of the important data on the disease itself, and then you'd be basically keeping a couple of variables on the pop, and then you'd be like, okay, this disease comes in it's weighted most heavily on this particular variable, lightly on this particular variable. Depending on your mix of resistances, this is how vulnerable your pop is. And that would, from kind of a memory management perspective, that would seem to be an effective way to handle it. But that's an interesting approach.
So like a pop in a like New World scenario would throw out any of those resistance factors?
It depends on what diseases and their common lineage would be roaming around on their particular continent, right? So let's say we've got our continent here. You may have, you might have a few versions of a given type of virus that's roaming around in here that's related distantly to a family of viruses that roam around over here. And so that virus comes over, you only have 10% resistance or something, and so then you get decimated. But there is some overlap, right? And the smaller, basically, from an island biogeography standpoint, the smaller the place that you are and the more geographically distant you are, the smaller the stock of diseases you would have to basically give you a diverse resistance to what else might be out in the world. And so you'd be able to achieve that same kind of devastating effect when foreigners show up with their diseases, right?
Right, but like if you were doing world gen and you were just like you were trying to have the gen to be like the first set of civilizations on the world and not like the civilization, like if your world gen was assuming that you were representing the first time that civilizations rose, then like no one would start with immunity factors and you would get them as you go?
You would have to, either you could do it that approach and then age your world by 10,000 years and leave it on for a week or something, or you could just infer it based on, like I'm already thinking of like some algorithms you could write where you would be like, okay, so this culture, these people here are part of such and such culture. The range of that culture is a certain geographic range, and so they cover this amount of land area, which stands to reason that they would have been exposed to these types of diseases. So then from the cultural level, then you would drill down to each of the populations and then assign with some random variation their resistances based on their geographic dispersion. And so that would kind of be the way that you would procedurally generate what kind of resistances they start out with. And it wouldn't be perfect, and the more the game would go on, the more you would come into a proper equilibrium, but it would get you like 90% of the way, right? Versus if you had a culture which existed on a continent which was really big, you would basically say, okay, this culture is on this continent which is really big, really populated, so therefore we can assume that you, boom, 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 have been exposed to this, this, and this because, these other cultures have been exposed to a particular strain, so.
Right, but what I'm saying, like, if you were trying to, not like a world where you're trying to simulate the world has been doing stuff for a bunch of time, but like if you were trying to play a game where you were like, all right, I'm going to play the first civilization that reaches the Bronze Age in the history of this planet, nobody would have endemic diseases yet.
Sure, yeah, I could imagine, and that would make things a lot easier, where you would just, so for instance, let's say there's two game modes, right? There is Fallen Empires mode, where the world has always been, and civilizations have risen and fallen. In that case, we would go with the procedural method, where you just kind of throw diseases all over the place. But then I imagine you could check a checkbox where you're playing through the world where civilizations are arising for the very first time, and if that's the case, then you would have there would be much less disease resistance, and then, you could just give like everybody very little resistance, other than what you would expect them to be exposed to locally. So that would be another approach that would work just fine. That would be easier than the procedural gen approach, to be honest. Totally doable. Does that answer your question? I tried to answer your question 3 times and failed. So.
You got it in the end. It was good enough. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Who else? Zach says, so my suggestion was that you have 4 to 6 immunity factors, and a pop's immunity is like blah 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 blah. So they are largely resistant to these. They hit D, E, and F. Some resistance to A. and are totally hosed by B and C diseases. If you have the B and C diseases on continent 1 and D and E diseases on continent 2, that gives you an Aztec smallpox situation. Yeah, totally. Is each disease one letter, or are diseases comprised of multiple letters? Yeah, that's sort of in keeping with the conversation we had earlier. Zach had brought up. It might also work well with race.
I like this idea.
Yeah, and that's a pretty economical way to handle things too. I think we haven't actually ran the numbers, but that's a good idea. I think that might also work.
Like obviously the actual thing would be much longer, so I don't know how much that would complicate it.
Yeah, it's like
like 5 diseases, but.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you can kind of do some napkin calculations, like okay, this many pops are in the world based on this many provinces, and we have this many variables determining what their resistance is. Where it gets tricky, though, is anytime you have populations moving around, or just individuals moving around. So let's say you have a pop. Let's go to our cool little Mediterranean place that we had earlier. Where was it? Our little Achaia. Here it was, down here. So you got like a province here or something, right? And you have a bunch of pops living there. A couple of people from those pops move over here or something like that. You basically need to recalculate sort of the distribution of resistances based on how many people moved and stuff like that. And so there's other kind of complicating factors, but it's probably doable. You just have to rig up some additional sort of disease resistance recalculation functions.
I mean, it only matters if you're going to have, like, if 1% of the population has different disease resistance, does that actually matter? Or do you need, like, I feel like you need 20 or 30% of the population to have a different disease profile for it to actually impact.
You're probably right, yeah. And in most cases, I expect, like, the important migrations are going to involve like whole pops picking up and going places, and so yeah, it probably isn't that much of a.
Well, in that case, you got to recalculate everything anyways. So
exactly, right. And you can infer too that with new births, assuming that maybe it's not the same for harpies. I'd have to read about what kind of antibodies get passed along from mother to children. But assuming that, if most of your animals are mammals and antibodies are being passed on through breastfeeding, then most of the antibodies would be conferred onto offspring. So you can just assume that when you have a new cohort of younglings come in, they just have the resistance of their parents.
I mean, you kind of have to have some level of decay, otherwise you get to the point by year like 300 where everybody's immune to everything.
Right. Well, the question is like the mechanism of decay, right? So if the mechanism of your decay is the evolution of the pathogen, then so that you can have the element of decay can be either not all of the antibodies being passed on, or it can be due to the evolution of the disease. And if that's the case, then for a specific disease, you'd need to be able to determine, like, okay, so you have either this much anatomical disease change versus just like genetic drift or something. I don't know. We'll have to figure that out, but
I mean,
yeah.
I think at that point you're going to get back into memory management issues.
Yeah. Well, it depends. Like if you're actually running, if you're running the calculation at the disease level, then you're kind of cheating, though. I don't know. There's something we have to think about. I'm sure there's a way to make it not too complex, performance-wise.
I mean, you say cheating like it's a bad thing. Programming is all about cheating.
But no, I mean cheating as in not having fidelity to the way that disease is. A whole disease doesn't evolve simultaneously. You have one virus that mutates and and then expands outward from there, right? As opposed to.
But would it, like it might be like design principle, but does it matter if we are really faithful to what happens, so long as we are faithful to the way that it happens. Is the question I think we should be asking.
True, yeah, but oftentimes I would argue that that you have to have some fidelity to the way that it happens in order to get the outcome that you want. But yeah, in this case, it's impractical to. It would seem to me more than likely we couldn't have like 50 strains of every disease roaming around with their own qualities and stuff like that, right? So we have to make some kind of compromise somewhere along the line.
I just mean that if you can create something that mimics how the fully faithful model behaves, then should it really matter if it doesn't obey the exact principles?
Probably not, right? It's always going to be.
I think the problem there is if you're just chasing the effect and not the actual mechanism, you end up with stuff like in certain games by a certain publisher that I'm not going to mention, where you have certain things that seem to work really well so long as you are trying to mimic exactly what happened in history, but as soon as something diverges, you don't really see the kind of follow-on knockoff effects you would see in real life, because the system is only trying to model the end effects, and if you're only modeling the end effects and it's not modeling what causes those effects, it means that you're not going to get like the kind of synergistic way that things interact to actually produce effects when things are not the way you expect them to be.
Right. I think that's a great way to put it. Basically, you're no longer a deep simulation. Like the point of sort of trying to make those effects emerge as opposed to determine them is that when you do deviate from the intended effect, you get these really interesting outcomes that you weren't anticipating, but which are logical, right? And that's what sort of. So, but it's always going to be a compromise, right? If you go too deep, too deep trying to perfectly simulate something, then you're burning half of your performance on making soil realistic, right? I understand the struggle, right? But it's going to have to be a compromise. But I mean, it's a good point on both sides. Let's catch up on what's going on here. Looks like you guys are getting into the weeds nice and good on that previous point. Yeah, 10 immunity factors. This would be a great subject to continue in the Songs channel or the Inner Circle channel too, to help spitball some of these ideas related to disease.
So how are diseases tracked, like on a programming level? Like are they? Like, is the disease like a variable on a given an agent, or is the disease itself an agent?
I would say, I mean, we could approach it from a couple of perspectives, but what I had imagined was that they would actually be a kind of simplistic agent that would roam around through populations, right? And that would almost proactively be attacking here and there. So rather than, from a programming perspective, rather than just purely iterating around through existing populations and deciding how much the disease spreads or whatever, you would be iterating over like instances of the disease on a population, like almost like a tick, sucking blood out of it, and then having it sort of look around and be like, all right, do I jump onto this merchant here who then is going to carry me over to this other city? And then once I'm there, I get iterated over again and decide that I'm going to attack this this agent or this pop, right? So it kind of, I imagine it existing in that kind of fashion, and it really helps to conceptually work out how to model it. That was kind of how I imagined that it would operate.
That's kind of what I was hoping for, except for the part where you mentioned like the disease, like the way you word it, it sounds like the disease is like strategizing. Like it's like, oh yeah, this guy's a merchant. He can carry me over to another territory. That's good for me because I want to spread stuff. Like diseases don't generally have that level of cognition. But the idea I had was, what maybe normal diseases just kind of spread out more or less randomly, but like maybe there's magical diseases that do work.
Sure. Well, I wasn't expecting that they would literally be logically evaluating their surroundings, but from the perspective of programming, sort of the approach to programming them in would be as though they were like an agent And so, yeah, you would basically, it's sort of active versus passive voice, right? Is the disease acting upon the world, or is it being acted upon by the world, right? And it would be the approach of, from a design perspective, from a programming perspective, as a disease being like a discrete entity that's doing stuff to the world. But it wouldn't really be behaving the way that like a merchant agent or an army agent or something like that would be operating. Something I wanted to bring up right before we get, so we don't forget it, is all of the other covariables that are, and I've mentioned it a few times, but all the other covariables that are related to the severity of diseases. And a lot of people think of diseases as just sort of having a static infection rate for a given population. But aside from just the ability of diseases to spread due to like geographic factors and connectivity between societies and people going from place to place, you also have the condition of the society itself and the people that live in it, right? And so what's been extremely common is that you tend to see disease outbreaks occur when things are already really bad, right? So there's a famine, and because you're malnourished, either calorically or nutritionally, your body has to economize, and so one of the things it has to economize on is the immune system, which makes you more vulnerable to diseases, which increases the R0 value of the disease. And so the condition of the people in a society will also be a major determinant of how diseases spread and how badly they tend to be, right? So before the Black Death, you basically had this horrible chain of events where I believe you had like a terrible drought followed by then terrible flooding, and so you had, it was almost like the old world was a tinderbox waiting for a disease to go through. And so if people hadn't been facing those other challenges and they hadn't taken a hit to their immune system, there's a good chance that the pandemic may not have been as bad as it was. And so go ahead.
It was basically a perfect storm?
Say again?
So it was basically a perfect storm?
Perfect storm, yeah, absolutely. And so that's something that, I don't want to say I'm excited about it, but like, I can't wait to start killing people because they're malnourished, kick them while they're down. No, like basically, because we're intending to track the nutrition of people in game, of populations in game, we'll be able to use that as another variable that determines how bad a disease pandemic is. In addition to like things like crowding and circumstances like that. You can look at how many calories a given pop is getting, what their protein is like, what their other nutrition is like from things like spices, and then use that to determine, okay, well, how vulnerable is this population to infection? And so how well you're able to take care of your people, how well you can make sure their bellies are full will determine like whether they end up taking a hit when the disease rolls through. Yeah, so that's another. Any questions related to that subject?
Actually, that was something I was meaning to ask before we moved on. Mostly related to like the computational / programming side of things. Those regions you see in stream, when we zoom a bit further in the static ones, how many of those are there approximately in the game?
Oh, you mean as in sort of like the quote-unquote provinces?
Yes. Because I'm wondering if you could, like, you don't need, under reasonable assumptions, I think that, well, at least I think it's a reasonable assumption, that most people within the same province, like, the pups there, of the same race at least, will generally have the same resistance to a specific disease. So I was wondering if you could, instead of tracking it per pup, resistance to diseases, if instead of tracking that per pup level, you could track it on province level. and then allow for more detail that way, because I imagine that's significantly cheaper computationally.
That's true. I mean, that's a possibility, right? And you could then, for instance, so that's a possibility where you could track resistance on the province, and then you would use that. Basically, you would be storing the variable there, and then when you calculate kind of infection, then you would drill down into the pops that are a part of that province and be like, okay, so these people here are malnourished, but these aren't.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Because yeah, certainly you're going to have obviously far fewer provinces than pops, because you have multiple pops in a province. So yeah, that's a good point. And this is going to be something that we're going to iterate over, obviously, for quite some time as we start to implement these factors. So, anyone have any comments or questions related to what we've discussed in the past 10 minutes? Particularly,
well, yes, when you said that the disease could be, from a programming perspective, and sort of an actor acting on the world, that made me think of intentional spreading of diseases, biological warfare, like the Mongols using catapults to launch rancid corpses of cows into besieged cities or something like that. Could that be in the game?
I suspect. I mean, I think, from my understanding, I could be wrong, but from my understanding, in general, the idea of disease warfare in history is a bit overblown. But you would think that in a fantasy setting, especially with things like necromancers and whatnot, that it would be something that could occur. But I probably would think that it's not something that was super duper common, mainly just because the risk of screwing yourself. I mean, it's like siege camps are already notoriously terrible for diseases, but then to start start employing disease warfare, it would have to be something that is very deliberate, and you would have almost institutional knowledge and tradition of using it for that purpose. But one point that's related to what you mentioned is the ability of armies to transport diseases unintentionally, which was extremely common, right? It was one of the ways that the Black Death spread in North Africa, for instance. You had some emirs on military campaign moving the disease around. It's how one of the big reasons that it spread in along the Andes as well. And so that's another interesting point, because we all know, right? Armies are already spreading diseases. They're little petri dishes as is, right? As we all know from the kinds of attrition that occurred from military campaign. So that's another important point to consider. One of the reasons I think that a lot of the sort of the, what would you call it, folklore about armies using biological warfare came up to begin with was because they were already infected with so many things. And so you can imagine situations where, like, the society being attacked is like, oh, they brought these diseases to intentionally use against us, when in fact in a lot of cases it was probably just like and they were sick and the disease spread, and it wasn't necessarily something that was a conspiracy or something. But anyway, yeah, how would diseases affect armies in general actually is something a player brought up that I thought was a really good thing to go over. Like, I think diseases in armies need to be really, really important, because they, in many cases, like, a disease outbreak is what ended a lot of invasions. Like, it was a thing that it was one of the one, aside from logistical considerations, it was one of the things that made projection of power over long distances extremely difficult, right? I mean, a lot of the famous examples, right, with the Ottomans attempting to capture like Vienna, for instance, and being struck down by disease when they were almost certain to win, those kinds of situations. And I would say in most warfare that involved any distance, you had more casualties from diseases in camp than from the actual battles themselves. And so that's something we absolutely want to be able to consider in game, because it for a couple of reasons. One of the most important ones in my mind is it's an excellent check on the power of large empires who are trying to move large armies over long distances in crammed ships and in crammed camps. And so it'll be one of the mechanisms that helps to prevent large empires that are powerful from just snowballing in absolutely every direction. And so that's definitely a good point, A player. Something we want to...
So even if they do that, they risk bringing foreign diseases back to them and then through the surface and then setting off internal...
That's another great point too, yeah. And then it's funny because we want to be able to, in Songs of the Aeons, to capture that kind of asymmetric damage that can be done from small societies to bigger societies, right? Because you can have a massive empire decide, we're going to sail down to these islands and capture this island for whatever purpose, and then transfer some strange and exotic disease back to the empire that then lays them low and sets them back 100 years or something. And so that's another great example that I think the system that we're considering should be able to capture.
Clearly, the trick is to be like Europe and start so plagued that the natives had nothing to hit you with.
Yeah, right. Just hit them harder, way harder. And, yeah.
Actually, syphilis originated in Mesoamerica and came to Europe.
Sure, yeah.
That was really debated.
Oh, is it really? Yeah, I think I heard that too.
There's more recent studies that they may not come from Mesoamerica, but it is one of those things that's not like 100% no.
I mean, the Black Death came from Asia, right? Like,
well, yes, but I was just specifically referring to like the New World, not to Asia. Asia obviously is where a lot of really unpleasant diseases have come from, sadly.
So yeah, and interestingly, also people think of the Americas and the diseases that struck down the natives, and they tend to think of smallpox and things like that. But apparently, old world malaria hitched a ride too over to the New World and caused some havoc too. So yeah, they got hit by a lot, and then then you have, it seems like when you hit a critical mass of death in a society, when you cause enough disruption that you basically break up geopolitical units, you break up families, you break up supply chains and things like that, then that's when you have sort of these aftershock effects where you have additional casualties from hemorrhagic diseases or just from the decay of society in general, because then you've disrupted people's food supplies, aside from everyone just being in an emotionally completely annihilated state. And then you have kind of these secondary effects related to just the collapse of society. And that'll be an interesting... Haven't given any thought into... I would expect kind of the natural mechanics of what we've already built should hopefully take effect and cause societies to be at risk of collapsing into a smoldering heap. But that would be part of kind of the point of songs. Okay, we're going to kill off this many people. Let's see what happens. Let's see. Okay, any other questions that anyone can think of?
Well, I was thinking of how panic would be implemented, because theoretically there could be a disease that is not particularly deadly, but it causes some great fear, some great panic that results in a lot of death, even though the disease itself doesn't kill that many people.
Yeah, I wonder. Seems like the general trend seems to be it's pretty incredible. Like with the Black Death, how many? And there was maybe a year back I listened to a big long course on the Black Death in detail, and what was really incredible is how many people just pretended like nothing was happening right up until the moment like it appeared in their household. pretty incredible how people can, they would hear the stories of mass death from afar and just kind of like, God will protect us, we'll be fine. And then there was this recurring saying that they'd be dancing in the morning and dead by the evening. And then that's the point where it seems like you would have a lot of panic, and then like that would be a major mechanism for spreading the disease. Okay, my whole family died. Now I'm going to try and escape from my town and run to the village nearby, because I don't really know necessarily what this thing is all about. And then that's how your disease would spread. I don't actually know in pre-modern times. I mean, presumably like rumors would start and stuff like that, even without a disease, and cause turmoil. So I wonder to what extent like the rumor mill could grab onto a disease that wasn't that bad, and then and cause unrest. I imagine it would happen, right? It seems like that would be the kind of thing you would kind of have some kind of event launch off of that kind of situation locally. If you're playing as like a local count or something, and a disease, a not terribly bad 5% casualty disease is passing through your province, and the rumors get started, and there's unrest, and suddenly people are blaming you for it for some reason, and you're trying to kill them because you can imagine that kind of situation where you could have kind of an event chain launch off that, which could be interesting. So yeah, I mean that's a possibility, but not something that I could firmly promise on, since it's a bit more of an edge case. But I imagine that kind of plays into the category of the kind of mechanics that would sort of auxiliary mechanics that could be built off of diseases, right? All of the interesting things that happen once the disease hits, right? You even saw that a bit in Mail and Taxes. A disease would show up, and you'd have to decide what the heck you were going to do about it. And you could almost imagine a situation where people overreact to it, and doing the right thing isn't necessarily in line with what people want you to do, and you got to figure out how to deal with it. Any follow-ups?
This might be something that's been discussed in other contexts, but like in addition to how you do, in addition to like that, how do you know what the player knows necessarily about as the disease is spreading? Like, is the player going to have full visibility of everything that's happening, or are they only going to see like, oh, there's disease in this province, it's bad?
I would imagine, depending on how it would depend, right? It would kind of depend on, like, you could sort of imagine a minister coming to you and being like, giving you some ambiguous but ballparkish figures on how many people have died, and you can kind of, I would like the player to have to work from some uncertainty. Like, one thing I don't want is for you to be bombarded with every single number in the entire game, like you do. You shouldn't be able to spreadsheet your way out of a pandemic in game, right? You kind of have to sit back and rub your chin and make some judgment calls and deal with some of the uncertainty in almost a qualitative way. But yeah, I guess if you, for instance, had a really great census system or something, a highly organized government, you could get like some pretty exact figures or something like that. That might be one of the reasons you would want to invest in an organized bureaucracy to begin with, right? It's to be able to get those kind of figures and act on them. But in general, in songs in general, like we want to avoid this sort of I am God, I know the position of every single molecule in the universe type of gameplay that you get in in games like Europa Universalis, right? What's Calandial saying? Hey, if you wanted to participate, you should have just go to channel. This is like so Calandial, so I whisper in the backgrounds. All right. Any other questions? Let's see.
Well, if no one else has anything to say, I can keep going. I have a whole .txt file full of questions that I wrote.
Thanks for preparing.
Anyway, I wondered how the game simulates some areas having more diseases than others, like swamps and jungles having lots of malaria, while glaciers and tundra have no malaria.
Oh yeah, I mean that's totally. It's great because we have all of those background ecological variables. It's really easy. It should be really easy to be able to come up with to be able to inform where those types of diseases come from, right? I mean, so when you're thinking in terms of like diseases that are ecosystem related, oftentimes it's related to whether things like insects can survive in a given climate, right? Right, so jungles and tropical and temperate wetlands tend to be notorious for those kinds of problems. What's interesting though is like with wetlands, you have this peculiar case where wetlands simultaneously have health benefits, but also can be breeding grounds for insects that transmit diseases, because wetlands can efficiently filter out the water. And so if you have a city up here which is dumping its piss and shit in the river, and the water's bouncing around in different wetlands along the way, then it's theoretic. In most cases, it should be filtering out the water and making it safer. One of the big mistakes that civilizations have made in history is they've looked at all of the wetlands that naturally exist along rivers, and they say, oh man, these wetlands are useless. Let's just drain them all and turn them all into arable lands. And then they just end up completely and utterly removing all the things that would purify the water. And then you end up with things like cholera, right? For everyone that's downstream of another urban center or farming communities and things like that. So that's kind of from both angles, right? What'll be interesting too is, for instance, to have large wetland areas that might, for instance, that would have potential diseases there, but the people that have been living there for X amount of hundreds of years are resistant to the diseases, and the big empire of mountain people who have no resistance to those diseases are trying to invade, but then like suffering from all of the diseases they don't have resistance to. And it would almost be like the swamp people would sort of have a disease fortress insulating themselves from potential invaders. Sorry for the stream of consciousness, but but yeah, I mean that's an interesting point that you bring up. Kind of like the sort of ecology of an area also can influence the ways that diseases spread, and can have geopolitical influences as well. From my understanding, the higher latitudes tend to have far less biodiversity, far fewer insect populations, and so therefore tend to have less of those kinds of diseases associated with tropical jungle and wetlands. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that's exactly right. That's what happened in southern Africa. South Africa has a Mediterranean climate, so it could be settled easily by Europeans, but as they went north, they kept dying due to malaria and sleeping sickness and so on, because they didn't have any immunity to those diseases.
It's funny because if you look at all of the Anzac countries, if you look at the Anglosphere, for instance, go beyond the Anglosphere, look at like all of the places where white Europeans actually colonized, and that didn't just like impose their dominion. It's all of the places which have temperate climates that don't have the diseases that they have no resistance to, right? Like even La Plata, right? Like why does Argentina have so many like white people and the rest of Latin America doesn't really. Well, probably because Europeans were like, okay, well this is some place that doesn't have the kinds of diseases that we don't have resistance to. This is a place that we can survive pretty well. And so you kind of end up seeing those kinds of patterns emerge, right? You look at the coast of Australia, right? Up against the mountains, you have this temperate climate, which is reasonably favorable. And as soon as you go over the mountains, you're in the outback, and things are a lot less favorable.
There was absolutely a lot of that, and there's also kind of this inverse of ecological imperialism that happened, where like a lot of plant and animal species were taken from Europe and kind of supplanted native ecosystems in a lot of places. It was like the Europeans brought their ecologies with them to some degree.
Yeah, and sometimes in a way I would argue that was like not even necessarily a good idea. Like you had
not been a very bad idea.
Well, I mean, so there's the good idea and the bad idea from the perspective of it was bad for native ecosystems, and then there's from the perspective of it wasn't even good for you, like the colonizer, right? So you go to like Lake Texcoco, right, in modern day Mexico City. The Aztecs had this spectacular agriculture system that was produced these fantastic yields, and then the conquistadors come and are like, what is this crap? These aren't like the crops we're used to, and like kind of just basically screwed up a lot of the natural agricultural potential of the area because it just wasn't the type of agriculture they were used to. And it was like...
And they brought malaria with them, which then turned around and infected and killed them.
Yeah, well, that was bad too, right?
This ecological spread happened not just with European colonialism, but also many thousands of years ago. And Jared Diamond talks about it in Guns, Germs, and Steel, about how in Mesopotamia there was the package, as he called it, of species, and then that spread to the east and west along that latitude. And so over thousands of years there was this ecological change as sheep and cows and so on were spread.
Very true, yeah.
Isn't Guns, Germs, and Steel like widely considered unreliable by historians?
Collapse is probably a more reliable book by him. It's sort of like every book that is... I think Jared Diamond has a lot of really broad strokes that he makes, this grand theory of everything that has a lot of holes, but like, I think because Guns, Germs, and Steel is so popular, it got just like a lot of extra scrutiny. And anytime you're trying to make a complex subject that doesn't get a lot of coverage normally, when you're trying to popularize it for a lot of people, you're basically going to simplify certain things too much, and so you're going to get hit by the historians that spend their whole life studying it, right?
He also got kind of hit by the backlash against an outsider that institutions tend to have, where I don't even think he's like by trade primarily a historian. I think he's more of a sociologist. Yeah. So like, there's been I've noticed this actually, that there's a lot of very good ideas that a lot of people who aren't necessarily quote-unquote historians have, and they tend to get really visceral pushback from people who are like, you're not a real historian, you don't have my fancy piece of paper, you have to be wrong.
Yeah, and he also just got hit pretty hard by the sort of postmodern sort of like the postmodern academic community in a lot of ways for being, he was called, right, an environmental determinist and stuff like that. And a lot of it was kind of just arguing over semantics to some extent. But I think there were probably there's a lot of good historical critiques on specific sources that he used in some cases. But yeah, I think that's kind of another subject.
I think a lot of his general ideas tend to be solid, but people find like things to nitpick about, oh well, this particular number might not be accurate, so therefore I'm going to say that you're a hack.
Exactly, right. Mm-hmm.
But I mean, yes, he absolutely is very much on the ecological determinist kind of scale, and there's I don't know, I remember when I was taking university classes, there was like this, oh, well, we want to introduce more of the idea of agency into history where, yes, this particular group of people may have been horribly oppressed and murdered and slaughtered and killed by plagues, but we want to present history in such a way so as to not take away their agency. And I'm just like, they were horribly murdered and slaughtered. I'm pretty sure you, as a professor in the 21st century, saying something about them is not the worst thing that's going to happen.
Right, exactly. Yeah, well, the whole, we've been accused of being environmentally deterministic or whatever. I mean, it's sort of a pejorative, right? I guess the idea is, if you were to take like, some sociology classes at university, like environmental determinism would be like a pejorative, right? And they would say like, oh, you think that like the only thing that matters is the environment someone lived in, and there was no complex cultures or anything like that. But it's like,
yes, that's true. Your entire culture developed because of your environment. Congratulations.
But it's like, you have to make a nod to the fact that like you have stochastic developments like that can drive cultures in interesting places, and it's like, okay, you literally wouldn't exist if you weren't living on land that was producing food for you or whatever. But yeah, it's by no means like I think is Songs of the Aeons trying to just like reduce absolutely everything to, okay, you live in a desert, therefore you must be this way, or you're living in a jungle, therefore you must live this way. That's definitely, that would defeat the entire purpose of what we're trying to do with sort of a living emergent world where things evolve, and you can have two radically different cultures that live in the same place but have things in common because they have to have similar lifestyles because of what they happen to be given with their environment, right?
Right, because like if you're in the jungle and your culture is not jungle adapted, and you don't have modern technology where you can like order something on Amazon, you're gonna die.
Yeah, and you're just not gonna be. You're not gonna have, for instance, too, the same kind of agriculture in a place. You're not going to be farming andesolic soils the same way that you would farm eudisols. You just can't. It's not as fertile. It doesn't have the same texture. It doesn't have the same alkalinity. And so the way that you live is just going to be different than the way that someone lives somewhere else. And that's determined by the environment. You just can't really get around that. There's lots of other things that can vary, but
large parts of your culture will be based around how you make your food and how your farming cycles work, and so.
Yeah, for sure.
As with all things, it's a mixture. Even Jared Diamond noted that his model did not explain differences at a really small scale, so it could tell you why North Africa and Western Europe had different trajectories, but it couldn't tell you why different countries in Western Europe had different trajectories.
Right, exactly, because they're all existed within the same kind of culture and the same kind of ecosystem, so then you're looking at their own specific things, as opposed to the vast scale of, well, here are the crops you grow and here are some of the traditions you follow. It's well, does your leader during this specific time period suck, or are you a free thinker, or whatever?
Right, yeah, for sure. That's a good example.
To kind of go on a different, in terms of determinism, if we're making a game that's supposed to be fun, on some level, we might need even more we might need less determinism than average, just in terms of if I'm the player and I wind up with a crappy hand and I can't win no matter what, then I'm not gonna play.
No, well, Zach, here's where you're totally wrong, because the player doesn't get to do anything. They just watch. It's completely determined. Everything. When we say environmental determinism, everything is determined.
I mean, obviously, in terms of
you obviously have not watched enough Twitch streamers start as OPMs that they released in 1600.
I know that that's a playstyle. I know that that's a playstyle. I just mean that whatever the consensus on how much environmental determinism there is in the real world, we may want to just make sure that there's enough player determinism in the game that the game remains fun.
No, I think totally, yeah. And I think the thing is, I think a good analogy is kind of like you as the player are going to be kind of, at times you'll be paddling upriver toward an objective that you want against the current. Other times the current will be flowing with you as you paddle, and it'll be easier to achieve the specific things that you want because your environment, the conditions around you are operating in your favor, right? And the question is when and at what times and at what resources you want to use to achieve certain objectives depending on their difficulty. So, it could be that your culture is evolving in a particular direction toward a particular kind of agriculture, and you don't want them to, right? And you'll have to find mechanisms to prevent them from doing things like eroding vulnerable soils, right? And you'll have some agency in doing that, but you have to decide, like, okay, so how much of my capital do I want to use to fight this particular problem versus trying to solve a problem that's already kind of moving in my favor, right? And so it's kind of like, I think the limitation in your agency is what should make the game interesting, right? You can't do everything all the time. And so you have to pick and choose your battles, and the strategy comes in where you sit back and you kind of have to weigh those different options, right? If that makes sense. But I think it's a great point, right? Because you need to make sure that you have enough agency in the game that you're not just going along for the ride in a hands-off test or something, right?
I think because this is a fantasy game, there's a sort of easy way out of the determinism problem in the form of a magic system, where there would be a very deterministic world, but the player has access to, I don't know, some rain spell that could cause more rain to fall, and that would then allow better crops.
Yeah, well, I mean, so I think that's one way, but I think conventional means, too, is a way to escape the determinism, because you'd be surprised. So, I mean, a great example is like the the Amazonian civilizations that existed pre-Columbus, right, who created these super deep, fertile soils that were very divergent of the oxasols that existed along the Amazon River, where they had a culture where they were able to create something very unique that hasn't existed since in a place that normally could not sustain the kind of agriculture that they were doing. Like, I think there's conventional ways to achieve that kind of new stable equilibrium, and just as a leader you can attempt to encourage certain types of behavior. In history, you have philosophers in Athens arguing about agricultural methods and contemplating whether they should, basically pursue laws that would insist that people terrace their fields to prevent degradation of the soil column. And so I would assume as someone in government in the game, you would be able to try to pursue those same types of objectives, right? So I've given this example before, like if your culture is drifting toward a kind of a strip mining of the soils type of society that's chasing after quick agricultural gains, you could try to take notice of a fertility deity and raise them up as try to raise them up as like some kind of state deity to try to move the culture in the direction that you want, so that they have a different kind of lifestyle. Like, that's the kind of way I would expect that you would have agency. And maybe it doesn't work out, and the toe is too strong toward a specific type of culture. It just would kind of depend on how many resources you put into it versus what else you might be attempting to do. Sorry, I ramble a lot, but once I get going. Go ahead.
I have received another question that I'm supposed to ask you on behalf of someone else. So I'll do that before I forget. I'll read it verbatim. If you can ask how endemic outbreaks will be modeled, as they are kind of always going as far as I know.
Well, if the person asking the question would like to mod that into the game, they are totally welcome. Yeah, that's a little top hat beaver, I'd say. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on in the stream chat too. Given how you said that you want the world to be cyclical or something along those lines, how do you prevent indefinite technological progression? Yeah, that's a question that comes up a lot, Polar Weiss, right? Basically, we want to have mechanisms. We want to have, similar to disturbance ecology, we want regular disturbance events like diseases, which are a part of that equation, to basically to go through the world and push things back to earlier states, not necessarily in such a way that you can't resist it. They can happen in different places, different times. They can be things like disease pandemics or demon invasions or, or severe calamities and droughts that are worse than what you would have seen even in the real world, like little ice ages that are significantly worse. All kinds of stuff like that. Basically, and those things happened in history, but in Songs of the Aeons, they were going to be, either happen at a faster interval, or you occasionally have significantly more destructive versions roam through the world and knock things back to an earlier state. So people forget technologies, cities are abandoned, things of that nature, right? Let's see. Typical name. You're the one who got us to have this meeting, and I haven't heard you talk for a while. Got anything else?
Not in particular. So how far along are we? I haven't followed this closely for a good long while. I mostly just show up to the council meetings.
Yeah, so that's something I actually wanted to talk. I kind of went over a little bit earlier in the meeting here. Basically, I'd gotten a new job in computer science, thanks to Songs of the Aeons, actually. And so I had basically a month or two period where I was adjusting there, and then I'd gotten back into songs for about 2 weeks, started working on vegetation, and then COVID hit, and then that blew absolutely everything up. But now everything's kind of settling down again. We're getting back to work again. So unfortunately, I'd say in about the past 5 months, disruptions have kind of disrupted the progress. We got Calandial's worked on quite a few other quality of life things that needed to be done. We pretty much got, I'd say, about 80% of vegetation done, and we added in disturbance models to vegetation. Anyone who was watching some earlier streams would have seen all of the modeling that we did. I made a little Python model because I needed to learn PySpark for work, so I figured, let's do it in Python. Or we added in things like ecosystem growth with disturbances like wildfires, cold snaps, grazing animals, things like that. And so ecology should be pretty close around the corner. Recently, what I was working on in the past week or so was implementing seasonal water flow. Since we had seasonal weather patterns, we really wanted to be able to have things like seasonal water flow. And so you can see it changes based on what season you're in. And so you can have things like seasonal rivers too. And then that seasonal water flow will go on to inform how much water can exist in a tile. And so the plan from there on out is to take things like soil texture. Let's get soil texture, which will determine how well water can be retained in the soil at a given place. And so you can have great rainfall patterns, but if you have really sandy soil or low organic soil, the water just goes right through it. And so plants can't really utilize it very well. Whereas if you have silty or loamy soil, water can penetrate and then be retained in there quite nicely, so that even if you have a drought for a few seasons, there's enough water stored inside of the soil to be able to survive. It'll also make tiles and ecosystems in those tiles more resistant to things like wildfires due to droughts, because there's sort of like a reservoir of water. It'll also allow us to calculate how much water ends up in the aquifers, for instance. So, for instance, there's two things that can happen with water that rains, right, onto the land. The water can go into the soil and then permeate down into a lower aquifer before any plants can grab it. Or if it rains in the given area and the water is retained in the soil for a long time, the roots of the plants grab the water, pull it up, use it for growth, but then release it in the atmosphere to change weather patterns too. So you'll end up with less of an aquifer beneath the surface, but more of that water will then be returned to the local area, effectively terraforming the environment, right, and allowing for more plants to grow. So those are all the things that we're working on now, and we should have by hopefully 0.2. We finally we're pretty close to integrating all of the various cycles involved with plant growth, right? So you have the climate cycle, and you have the water flow cycle based on that climate and all of the rainfall, humidity, temperature factors. And then that rainfall and water flow then will inform vegetation, right? And then the plants turn around and then inform the climate cycle again through evapotranspiration, and also by altering the amount of sunlight that reflects from the surface, things like that. And so why is this interesting for gameplay purposes? Well, humans are really good at transforming the environment and causing desertification by annihilating things like verdant forests. And so what you'll have is when the world is virgin and young, you'll have places like our little Achaea here that has sort of a drier climate. When the game starts, you can expect this area to be reasonably well forested, partly due to the feedback loop that results from plants grabbing the water that would otherwise permeate the soil and then releasing it in the atmosphere. Well, if you come through and you chop down all those trees in this Sahel and Mediterranean environment, there's a good chance that then the trees just don't come back for 1,000 years, and it changes weather patterns and changes the organic profile of the soil, which then makes it even harder for water to be retained in the soil, and you end up with this feedback loop due to human activity. And this is exactly what happened in the Mediterranean over the past 1,000 or so years. And so those are the kinds of gameplay implications that'll emerge dynamically through the systems that we've already constructed. We hope. If that another long-winded answer to your question.
Is based mostly on real-world ecology, or are there also like fantasy biomes?
Good question. So right now the idea is we target specific categories. On the tile level, we target specific categories of plants. Right? So we have grasses, shrubs, conifers, and broadleaves. Conifers also kind of encapsulate like smaller leaved, water efficient types of plants that tend to be like forest fire resistant. And so basically these different vegetation classes respond differently to different types of conditions on the ground. So some plants like broadleaves thrive and are extremely competitive when they exist in nice and wet conditions. Shrubs thrive in dry conditions and are fairly resistant to things like wildfires. Grasses grow extremely quickly. They need a moderate amount of water, but they are outcompeted by every single other type of class of plants. Conifers are most competitive in somewhat water-constrained situations, resistant to wildfires and things like that. And so what happens is you also end up having these disturbances like grazers and fires and things like that, which, because they'll happen on a regular basis, will keep certain environments at an equilibrium with different vegetation types. So for instance, a lot of grasslands that existed in modern times and in prehistory actually had enough water to successfully survive, for broadleaf trees to survive. But grazers and fires effectively, when combined together, are enough to stunt broadleaves from ever being able to have any significant numbers in a grassland. And because of those disturbances, you're able to maintain a grassland biome from those interactions. And the idea is that in any given tile, your vegetation distribution is constantly changing based on those disturbances. So you can have a period where a tile is nearly a grasslands, and then in 200 years from now, the tile could be mostly forest. It could be like 75% tree, 15% grass, 10% shrubs. And those distributions are constantly changing. And what we do from there is we then construct specific biomes for that tile based on the distribution of these different types of categories of plants. And then we can determine and infer what kinds of, okay, so we're in an area that has tree types that belong to that olives belong to, and so we can infer that there's like olive trees there and stuff like that. Or there's certain types of grasses in a given area, so that we can infer there's certain types of wheats or rice, things like that. If there's certain types of, if the broadleaves are in a given area, we can infer, okay, so there's probably some broadleaves are the fruiting trees in most cases, and so you can infer these types of fruits based on the climate, those types of things. And 8 player, if you plant enough trees, can you increase rainfall? That's the idea, 8 player, right? Especially if you have water flowing into a given area that's dry. What you would expect would happen is that you would have more trees grow along where the water body happens to be, and then they would sponge up the water from the water body, release it into the atmosphere, and alter the rainfall patterns. And so you could literally also, if you wanted to, try to reforest an area that was deforested and attempt to sort of turn it into a new stable equilibrium, tip it over to a new stable equilibrium that would be a forest. That's something we would hope to do. All right, anything else? We're about an hour and a half in. We went over the development stuff, what we're working on now. I guess some other things on the development front, like I really wanted the way that Songs of the Aeons, like the way that we're developing it was intentionally designed to be resilient to things like COVID, right? Or to major life changes. It's been tempting to, for instance, quit my job and live off my savings and try to make the Songs of the Aeons thing work and work on it full time, full steam ahead. But that kind of approach, I feel like we're not at that point where we could do it safely. And I feel like if we were to do something like a Kickstarter and try and do it full time and then have it fail, that could be like the death of Songs of the Aeons. And so at the current time, it's still kind of meant to be this very, very detailed side project that hopefully we can develop indefinitely with the current strategy. And hopefully one day, if either I can put away enough money, or if we can get a critical mass of fans and contributors or a saleable product, at that point, hopefully we can go at it full time. I would happily make much, much less working on songs than I do right now with my current job. But when you've got kids and stuff like that, you have to kind of... If I were single with no kids, I'd be happy to live in a shack somewhere and work on songs and live off of $500 a month or whatever, but no, I can't do that right now. But it is the dream, and I think about it every single day. And it's not anything that's gonna be abandoned anytime soon, unless I get hit by a truck or something. Hey Gutsta. So, anyone got anything else they want to contribute, or anything else to discuss?
On any college I was thinking, so I was thinking, what would it take to make, say, a mushroom island from, Minecraft or something?
Oh, like a alternative biome? Good question. I mean, it's...
possible?
Well, see, that's the thing, and that's where it goes back to... I forget who had mentioned it, but, the magic equation, mushrooms are the most abused, ecologically inaccurate living thing that gets thrown around in fantasy games. Mushrooms, we can just put them anywhere, and they eat they don't need sun, right? So they can grow anywhere, right? But it's like, stuff like mushrooms, fungus, they need something to feed. There has to be some other biological thing that they're feeding off of. And so, for instance, a biome that's purely made of mushrooms would need to have some kind of ecological subsidy. So, for instance, I could imagine the mushroom island if, for instance, you had a bunch of sargassum weed. If that island was in the middle of a sea current that was throwing like massive amounts of sargassum weed onto the island constantly, and that's what the mushrooms were living off of, yeah, that would be the way that you would achieve that kind of objective. But there would need a lot, unless we were to just go the way of magic, then there would have to be some compelling ecological reason why you would see that kind of biome emerge. And, it could be. But there would just need to be some kind of compelling reason for it that's logically consistent with the rules that we have, sort of the rules of physics as we've defined them. And I want to avoid just waving my hands and saying, 'cause magic, as much as possible. But yeah, interesting question.
No, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so let me talk this. I'm sorry, I need to go into it. Sorry, I just said I was in the middle of in a public space and I couldn't move, but so my question is, so there's gonna be like sets of like flora or fauna. So is there gonna be like a system where like one continent has like the equivalent, say, South American fauna or like mega sloths or whatever? You can define like sets of continent equivalents where so like one has like one continent can have elephants and.
We would like to naturally. It's tricky because you can imagine how if you wanted to represent the more animals you try to represent, the more unique plants you try to represent, the more of a memory impact you're going to have, right? The more you have to determine each of their individual behaviors and how they might spread and things like that. But I would absolutely say that there would be some variation in distribution. Obviously, these types of variables cannot exist on a tile because there's 1 million to 2 million to 5 million tiles on the planet, and so that kind of data would have to be you would probably, I would imagine you'd have a tiered kind of situation where you would ask the question, all right, so how much of these things can we expect would be sort of existing in the background that sort of track their parent group of vegetation type, and how many of these things do you actually have to keep numbers for on like a province, right? So when you're dealing things like grazing with things like grazing animals or large predators and things like that, that's the kind of thing that you would keep as like a variable on a tile because they can have a significant impact on gameplay, right? So you can expect like a lot of pastoralists who rely on hunting and stuff like that would need to be following herds, and so population figures of the herds would matter. People who, and for pastoralists and for more sedentary herders, like you'd have to be worried about predators because they could be preying on your sheep and your goats and your cattle and things like that. Whereas other things like, all right, so how many little bunnies are sitting in my ecosystems? Okay, how much does that really matter for gameplay? So
what I'm more asking about is like also like determine so like for example in real life I'm talking about like the America, they didn't have any like equivalent to horses that you could domesticate. So that I'm talking more about that sort of thing, like tracking what animals are available for societies to use,
right?
Like,
and that would be the important types of things that you would want to track, right?
Yeah.
And even fantasy animals that may not exist in the real world too. Those just that would be the example of the animals that you'd really want to make sure that you track. And it's unfortunate because there's other sort of cool animals that you can imagine would be fun to have in game, but just don't make a big enough gameplay impact. And so the way that would work is we would, for instance, they would be in the game, but you would have a function that you would rig up that when you examine a tile or a province, it would say, hey, so these animals are theoretically here, but you can't. They're just kind of it's sort of a dwarf fortress flavor type of thing, as opposed to okay, they're literally existing as a number on this tile. So yeah.
Yeah, actually, something about it that I was thinking about is that perhaps in that case, maybe we could also add like some more speculative things as well. Like, so for example, we could add like a set of fauna for like a hypothetical Antarctica that never, because like for the longest time Antarctica used to be green. So if you have like a polar continent in a world that isn't covered in ice, then you could say, oh, maybe we should give it like speculative Antarctic fauna,
Yeah, that would be cool. And I think especially what would be fun in game 2 is to sort of plunk things that in history would have been ecologically viable in a given place, like horses on the grasslands of North America, right? And then like see what happens, see what would have been different, that kind of situation.
There were horses in North America. They were just one of the species that didn't make it through a combination of contact with early natives and climate change.
Oh, really? Was it? Oh, right. So the window wasn't there, so to speak?
Right, like people didn't have domestication tech, and they didn't know, hey, maybe we shouldn't kill these things and eat them. And so people were killing them and eating them while the climate was changing in a way that was disadvantageous to them surviving. And since they'd never encountered people before, they didn't know, hey, these are going to kill and eat us. And the overall combination was that a bunch of North America lost all of its domesticated bull species during that time period.
Right, that's interesting. I didn't realize there were actually horses in there. It kind of makes sense because that.
There are also camels. Camels are native to North America, and they moved to the Old World through the land bridge.
Yeah.
I want to say that North America had a whole bunch of really weird megafauna at one point.
Like what was it? Armadillos the size of bread trucks.
Really weird.
The mega sloths. I want me one of those mega sloths, man. Just sit on the couch with me and just chill out.
So maybe like in the early game you could have like some extra megafauna like woolly mammoths or mastodons or megasloths or saber-toothed cats to simulate like the Ice Age.
Yeah, that would be cool.
But well, I mean, it depends on like the current conditions because like the game it like assumes that it's like paralleling real life history where like the game starts as the world is leaving an Ice Age, or that's what's so. Is that?
Sorry,
that's what the standard default starting scenario is, that the game starts like around 8,000, the equivalent of like 8,000 BC, where the world has just left the Ice Age and humans are hunting down the last megafauna, that sort of thing, right?
Well, it kind of, there's a whole nother angle to this too, in the sense that like monster ecology, like we haven't even touched on that. Like, so you had all this megafauna in prehistory, right? That made things interesting, but then like add into that, like, well, okay, what if they were semi-intelligent, like trolls and stuff like that, and how that would have made things more interesting, to say the least, for hunter-gatherers or even earlier civilizations, and how they interact with their ecology and stuff like that. That's a whole other factor that probably we can talk about in some future High Council meeting, I'm sure. Well, anyway, we're coming up on the 2-hour mark. I think we've covered just about all the material and a few other things as well.
Oh, yeah. One more thing I wanted to mention. I don't think it's in the game currently, but maybe as a far future thing, if you want to be really hardcore, you could actually like try to simulate, like try to go back in time like 200, like to try to simulate to determine where the animal placement by like simulating the breakup of a supercontinent and like seeing, so you can figure out where to put all the various animal groups. Like,
that's theoretically possible. So for instance, I could see a situation where, as part of that procedural generation algorithm, you would you would then evaluate where, for instance, where your plates broke up, where you have seafloor spreading, things like that, and be able to kind of infer. Yeah, I think that's definitely probably a possibility. And it wouldn't necessarily be too hard. Kind of depends on what we want to spend our time doing. We obviously already have, a lot.
Yeah, one more thing. I never asked how is progress actually coming along? Like, what more features do we need for 1.2?
Or 0.2?
0.2, I mean.
Well, we were in December, we were like 2 or 3 months away from 0.2, and then shit happened. I think we're reasonably close now. It's so hard for me to make promises because I'm in Florida right now, and it is literally the epicenter of like the pandemic, and I've got kids that are high risk, and it's like I'm in a good groove now, but who knows what's gonna happen with just everything crazy that's going on right now. But I feel like vegetation could be a month or two out. The thing is, like, there's a lot of other finishing touches I'm sure I'm gonna want to put on 0.2 to make it shine. So for instance, there's little things like once you have vegetation in, then you actually have to redefine the satellite map mode and stuff like that to properly reflect when you have bare soil and what kind of color it is based on the bedrock that's exposed and what color things are based on the type of vegetation there and how hydrated it is. There's all kinds of little things that you can retool and retune, and depending on how much of an impact we want to make as far as its impression on the audience, that'll kind of determine how long it takes from that point, right? There's sort of like, all right, the mechanics are in, and then there's we're making an official release. We want people to be wowed by it, right? And that's the part that is hard for me to account for how long that would take. I mean, right now with the pandemic and with the economy on the rocks, and with me wanting to not lose my job in the middle of a recession, like there could be a lot of things that interfere. But the important thing, in my opinion, is just to try to keep going, right? Because that's long term. That's, I feel like, what's going to allow us to succeed.
Oh yeah, one more thing. Have you actually done anything with like modding? Like, are the plans fully moddable? Like in 0.2, will the plans be fully moddable, or?
Yeah, so sure. Yeah, some of the other junior developers have come up with packages of like Andidi, for instance, was working on some of that stuff with plants, and even like technology packs and things like that. And so anytime anyone has any ideas, they can post, so we have a little archive of resources and things like that for future reference. But modding is, Calandriel's not here to talk about it, but modding is kind of a little bit of a hot topic right now, how deep we want to go with it, because there's this dig. Initially we're like, make everything moddable, yay! But then we began to realize, like, the more we want things to be moddable, the more it actually takes away from a lot of other potential resources, not just in development time, but also just in performance and sort of a conciliant structure for the game.
Yeah, but I guess that's okay. All I want to know is that people will be able to make their own plants or animals, like...
Oops, that was a mayonnaise, right? Oops. Sorry. Yes, it was a mayonnaise who had come up with some of the packs. You guys need to not have the same letters starting in your names. Sorry, but go. That should be totally doable.
All right, great. That's all I need to know. Thanks.
All right, so I guess let's go ahead and pack things in. Thanks everyone for showing up, and again, thanks no name, or a typical name, for urging us to do this, because it was definitely long overdue, and I shall continue to attempt to stream as often as I can and continue to move things forward. Go ahead and keep the Discord community alive too, because it's something that's I swing by every day and still value people's feedback. Thanks everyone.
So these are supposed to occur like monthly, right?
They're supposed to occur monthly. Whether that's practical, and maybe it will be practical. But maybe they're not always as long. Whatever, we'll see. Yeah, let's try to get into some kind of rhythm with these meetings. They're also they can be kind of inspirational too. But when there's not a lot of development time, and when most of my development time is going to be on the weekends, these meetings ultimately will end up subtracting from the time that I have for development. So it might be good to do it like once a month for like an hour or something like that. That might be a good idea.
I mean, it seems like it'd be kind of hard to get to plan on that when it's like we don't want to get too far ahead of what's actually getting built in this design discussion, I feel like.
That's a good point, yes. Because then we'll just run out of things to talk about. Or it'll get so far ahead that we're just having to equivocate about everything we say. Okay, well that's a little too far ahead to really... these meetings are kind of meant for people who have either contributed a lot in the past or people who are contributing a lot now to be able to get their ideas out and to have some influence on development and to help inspire us too. And so I think as long as we can specify that a lot of what's discussed in these conversations aren't like set in stone in most cases, then I think we should be pretty safe. But I do agree that if it's too frequent and development isn't moving fast enough, we could just kind of be retreading the same territory over and over again, or just run out of things to talk about. But we'll see. We'll kind of gauge it. We'll gauge it with how quickly development is going, because we may have a lot to talk about at any given moment. Or like it could just be, in the inner circle channel, if someone comes up with something that's really compelling that we can talk about, then maybe that's the time to have a meeting and discuss it. Stay engaged. But yeah, things are less chaotic, at least for now, so hopefully we can have more meetings than once every 5 months or something, 6 months. All right. Well, thanks, guys. I'll see you later.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for contributing. Thank you for your service.